The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, delivered not by a footman in polished livery, but by a weary post-rider who had ridden through the night to reach the modest townhouse before its occupant departed for church. It was thin, this letter, a single folded page, sealed with plain wax bearing no crest at all, and yet it would prove, before the year was out, to be worth more than every gilded document in the Duke of Ravensmere's own strongboxes. The morning was grey and unremarkable, the kind of English morning that gives no hint of the significance it is about to hold. Frost silvered the hedgerows beyond the window, a kettle sang somewhere below stairs, and in a small, sparsely furnished sitting room, a young woman broke the plain seal with fingers that did not yet know they were about to be handed the means of her own quiet revolution. She did not yet understand what the letter contained. She knew only that her solicitor's hand was unsteady where it had written her name, and that unsteady hands, in her limited experience of solicitors, rarely accompanied good news delivered easily. Some 40 miles to the north, in a house so vast it required its own village simply to keep its fires lit, a duke stood at a tall window overlooking grounds that stretched, uninterrupted, to the horizon in every direction his eye could reach. He had just been informed, by a steward who plainly wished he were anywhere else in that moment, of a small parcel of land, hardly worth the ink required to record its transfer, that had passed, through a distant and largely forgotten family connection, into the possession of a young woman he had never met and did not expect ever to think of again. He laughed when he heard the name of the property, a genuine laugh, brief and dismissive, the kind a man permits himself only when he is entirely certain a thing poses no threat whatsoever to the empire he has spent his life building. He was wrong. He would not understand quite how wrong for a great many months yet. Before this story carries any further, if the particular pleasure of watching a quiet, underestimated woman outmaneuver an entire dukedom through nothing but patience, cleverness, and an unshakable refusal to be small, is the sort of tale that keeps you returning night after night, do take a moment to subscribe, so that the next such story finds you the very hour it arrives. And in these opening minutes, before the deeper mysteries of this house begin to unfold, tell us in the comments below where in the world you are watching from tonight. There is something rather wonderful in imagining candlelight and quiet rooms scattered across every corner of the globe, all listening, together, to the same old story of a small estate that refused to remain small. Now, let us return to that letter, and to the young woman whose modest inheritance was about to become the very thing a duke could not stop underestimating. Her name was Cordelia Ashworth, 24 years of age, and she had spent the better part of the last 3 years learning, in painful increments, precisely how little the world valued a woman whose fortune had failed to survive her father's death. Mr. Edmund Ashworth had been a gentleman of modest but respectable means, a scholar of some minor renown, more interested in his library than his ledgers, and when a series of unwise investments, made in his final years at the urging of a business partner who vanished the moment the losses became apparent, had stripped the family of nearly everything, Cordelia had been left with little beyond her name, her education, and a determination she had not yet had cause to test. She had spent those 3 years in the household of an aunt in Bath, a woman of narrow sympathies and narrower conversation, who reminded Cordelia with wearying regularity that she was fortunate to be housed at all. Given how little she now had to offer any prospective husband beyond a pretty face and an education wasted on a woman of her reduced circumstances, Cordelia had borne this with the particular grace of a woman who has learned that arguing with small cruelties rarely diminishes them, and had occupied her private hours instead with reading, history, agriculture, the management of estates. Subjects her aunt considered entirely unsuitable and entirely beside the point for a woman with no estate left to manage. It was, then, a matter of considerable and painful irony that a letter should arrive informing her she had inherited precisely such a thing. The property was called Thistledown, a name that had, in recent decades, become something of a private joke among the great families of the county, a small, unfashionable manor of perhaps 200 acres, its soil said to be thin and stony, its house modest even by the standards of a country parson, tucked into a fold of land at the very edge of the vast Ravensmere estate, like an afterthought someone had forgotten to erase. It had come to Cordelia through her mother's side of the family, a distant cousin twice removed, who had died without closer heirs, and the solicitor's letter made plain, in tones of careful apology, that the property came with no income to speak of, considerable debts of its own, and a reputation, locally, as land not worth the labour of farming it properly. Her aunt, upon hearing the news, had laughed almost as readily as the Duke of Ravensmere would laugh some weeks later upon hearing it himself. A worthless field with a leaking roof, she pronounced. Is hardly the inheritance a sensible girl ought to celebrate. You would do better, Cordelia, to sell it for whatever pittance it might fetch, and use the proceeds toward a wardrobe that might yet secure you a husband before your prospects diminish further. But Cordelia, turning the letter over in her hands that Tuesday evening, had felt something stir in her that she had not expected. Not hope. Precisely. Not yet, but a kind of quiet, private defiance. It was hers. Whatever its condition, whatever the county thought of it, it was the first thing in 3 years that belonged to her outright, free of her aunt's narrow charity or her father's unravelled fortune. And a woman who has been told for 3 years that she has nothing left to offer the world discovers, sometimes, that even a worthless field can feel like the beginning of something. She did not yet understand how much that small field truly concealed. The Duke of Ravensmere, Charles Voss, 7th of his line to hold the title, and by every measure the county could offer, the most powerful man for 40 miles in any direction, had inherited an estate so vast that its exact boundaries were a matter of some dispute even among his own stewards. Ravensmere Park encompassed farmland, forest, a stretch of river prized for its fishing, and villages whose inhabitants owed rent, in one form or another, almost entirely to the Duke's own accounts. He was a man accustomed, in every particular of his life, to being the largest presence in any room, any negotiation, any parcel of land, as far as the eye could see. He was not, his acquaintances would have agreed, an unkind man in the manner of villains from cheaper fictions. He gave generously to the parish poor, maintained his tenants' cottages in good repair, and had never been known to raise his voice to a servant in anger. But he possessed, in equal measure to his generosity, an absolute and unexamined certainty of his own supremacy, a conviction, bred into him from the cradle, that the natural order of the world placed men such as himself at its summit, and that anyone occupying a smaller corner of that world occupied it because they were, in some essential way, smaller themselves. It was this conviction, more than any particular malice, that led him to laugh when his steward informed him of Thistledown's change of ownership. The little estate had been a minor irritation to the Ravensmere holdings for as long as anyone could remember, its boundary line cutting an awkward notch into what would otherwise have been a perfectly tidy expanse of Ravensmere land, its thin soil and shabby house serving no purpose the Duke could discern beyond mild aesthetic offence whenever his carriage happened to pass its gate. He had, in fact, made a standing offer to purchase it outright some years before, an offer the previous owner. Cordelia's elderly cousin had politely and repeatedly declined, for reasons the Duke had never troubled himself to investigate. He assumed now that the property's new owner, some minor gentlewoman fallen on hard times, would prove considerably more amenable to selling than her stubborn predecessor had been, and he instructed his steward, with the mild boredom of a man attending to a trifling matter, to renew the offer at the earliest convenient opportunity. Offer her twice its worth, he said, already turning his attention back to weightier matters. It is a scrap of land not worth the argument, and I should rather it were folded properly into the estate than left dangling at its edge like an unfinished sentence. He did not yet understand that the woman receiving that offer would decline it, not out of stubbornness, but out of a discovery she had not yet made, concerning precisely why his family had wanted that scrap of land for a great deal longer, and for reasons considerably more urgent than mere aesthetic tidiness. Cordelia arrived at Thistledown on a bright, cold morning, some 3 weeks after the letter first reached her, having sold what little jewellery remained to her name to fund the journey and the barest necessities of establishing a household. The house that greeted her was, if anything, more modest than she had been led to expect, a low, stone building of perhaps a dozen rooms. Its roof patched in places with slate of an obviously mismatched vintage, its gardens overtaken by bramble, and its single remaining servant, an elderly man named Hobbs, who had served the family for 4 decades and had apparently continued reporting for duty each morning, despite receiving no wages for the better part of a year, greeting her at the door with an expression of cautious, weathered hope. "You'll be the new mistress then," he said, looking her over with the frank assessment of a man who had seen a great many mistresses come and go across his long service and had learned to judge them quickly. "Small house, small land, but it's ours, miss, such as it is, and I'll not pretend I'm sorry to see it stay in the family rather than sold off to his grace, as I hear he's been wanting these many years." Cordelia paused at that, something in the old man's phrasing catching her attention. "These many years, Hobbs. The Duke has wanted Thistledown for a long while then." "Longer than you'd think reasonable for a man who owns half the county already," Hobbs said, with the particular dryness of a servant who has held his tongue on a subject for decades and finds some relief in finally loosening it, even slightly. "Your cousin, God rest her, always said there was more to his wanting than mere convenience. But she never told me what, precisely, and I never pressed her on it. Not my place, miss, and besides, some things are safer not known in a county where one family owns nearly everything in it." She did not yet understand what her cousin had known, or why she had guarded it so carefully. But she filed the old man's words away, the way she had learned, across 3 years of quiet observation in her aunt's house, to file away every small detail that did not quite add up. The house itself, for all its modesty, held a warmth Cordelia had not expected to find in it, sunlight through windows that, however cracked, still let in a generous northern light. A small library, dusty, but intact. That suggested her cousin had shared her own family's fondness for reading, and, in the cellar, a discovery that would occupy the first of her many mysteries at Thistledown, rows upon rows of old wine racks, empty now, but built with a care and expense that seemed entirely at odds with a house otherwise so plain. "There was a vineyard once," Hobbs told her, when she asked, "before my time, mind, but my father spoke of it. The south slope, where the brambles are worst now, that was vines once, and good ones, they say. Your cousin's grandfather planted them, and for a time Thistledown wine was spoken of quite favourably, even as far as London. But the vines were pulled up, 60 years gone now, and no one since has troubled to replant them." "Why were they pulled up?" Cordelia asked, "if they were so well regarded?" Hobbs was quiet for a moment, his weathered face carrying an expression she was beginning to recognise as the particular caution of a man who knew more than he wished to say plainly. "That, miss, I couldn't rightly tell you. Only that it happened sudden-like. The year-old Lord Thistledown, your cousin's grandfather, that would be, had his falling out with the Ravensmere family. Never spoke of it again after, my father said. Just had the vines torn out and burned, every last one, as though he couldn't bear the sight of them. What remained hidden beneath that scorched southern slope was far more valuable than either of them yet understood." Cordelia began, in the weeks that followed, the same patient cataloguing of her small domain that a more skeptical observer might have called obsessive, but which she herself understood as the only sensible response to inheriting a mystery disguised as a ruin. She read every book in the modest library, several of which proved to be her cousin's own diaries, their entries growing steadily more guarded across the final decade of the old woman's life. She examined every account book Hobbs could produce, tracing the estate's slow decline not to any obvious mismanagement, but to a series of small, curious misfortunes, a boundary dispute lost in court under circumstances that struck Cordelia, reading the old proceedings, as decidedly one-sided. A right-of-way suddenly revoked, a local bank, coincidentally connected to Ravensmere interests, that had called in a loan at precisely the moment Thistledown could least afford to repay it. No one in the neighbouring villages spoke openly of it, she noticed, though she caught, more than once, a certain wariness in the eyes of tenants and tradesmen when the subject of Thistledown's history arose. A wariness that suggested knowledge carefully withheld, rather than knowledge simply absent. It was in the 4th week of her residence that she found her cousin's final diary, hidden not carelessly, but with evident deliberate care, behind a false panel in the library wall, a discovery she made entirely by accident, running her hand along a shelf and feeling the wood give slightly beneath her palm in a manner ordinary oak had no business doing. The diary's final entries, written in a hand grown shaky with age, but no less sharp in its observations, spoke of a survey, an old survey, commissioned generations before Cordelia's cousin's own birth, that had established the true boundary between Thistledown and the Ravensmere estate along a line considerably more generous to Thistledown than the boundary presently recognised. That original survey her cousin had written had vanished from the county records decades ago. At almost precisely the same moment, a new, less favourable boundary had been quietly established in its place. A boundary that had, by curious coincidence, placed the entirety of Thistledown's finest land, including the slope where the vines had once grown, under Ravensmere's nominal claim. Even as the family had, for reasons her cousin could only guess at, never troubled to formally seize it. "They know the boundary is wrong," her cousin had written, in an entry dated only months before her death. "I believe the old Duke's father knew it, and this Duke knows it now, and I believe it is precisely why they have wanted this worthless little house so very badly for so very long. Not for its thin soil, whatever they may claim. For what lies beneath the southern slope, and for what the old survey, were it ever found, would prove was never rightfully theirs to claim at all." Cordelia sat with that final entry for a long while, the fire in the small library burning low, understanding at last why the Duke of Ravensmere had made his standing offer to purchase Thistledown so many times across so many years, and why her cousin, for all her poverty, had refused each time with a stubbornness the county had dismissed as mere sentiment. She did not yet know what precisely lay beneath that southern slope, worth so much careful, patient scheming across 3 generations of Ravensmere dukes. But she understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that the little estate everyone had mocked as worthless was, in fact, the one piece of land in the entire county that a duke had spent 60 years quietly, carefully, trying to make disappear. She resolved, that night, to find the old survey and to discover, whatever it cost her, exactly what secret it had been buried to protect. The search for the missing survey occupied the better part of the following 2 months, and it was in this period that Cordelia began, almost without noticing the shift in herself, to become something other than the quietly diminished woman her aunt in Bath had shaped her to believe herself to be. She wrote to the county records office and received, after considerable delay, a reply confirming that a survey of the relevant boundary had indeed once existed in their archives and had, at some point in the previous century, been removed, by whom or under what authority the current clerk could not say, though he noted, with the particular carefulness of a man who suspects more than he is willing to commit to paper, that the removal appeared to coincide with certain other alterations to the record made around the same period. She wrote, too, to a solicitor in London, recommended by her late father's old colleagues, a Mr. Fairweather, whose correspondence proved considerably more forthcoming than the county clerk's had been, once she had explained her circumstances and paid, from her rapidly dwindling funds, for his discreet inquiry. It was Fairweather who first suggested, in a letter that made Cordelia's hands tremble as she read it, precisely why a boundary dispute alone might not fully explain the Ravensmere family's decades of careful interest in her little estate. I have made certain inquiries among the mining surveyors of my acquaintance, he wrote, regarding the geology of the southern counties in the region of your property, and I find that the strata described in your cousin's papers, the particular composition of stone beneath what you describe as the vineyard slope, is consistent with deposits of considerable value. Of a mineral character, I would rather discuss with you in person than commit fully to a letter that might, conceivably, fall into unintended hands. I would urge you, Miss Ashworth, to guard your discoveries carefully until we have spoken. She did not yet fully understand what Fairweather suspected lay beneath her modest, mocked little estate, but she understood enough, reading between the careful lines of his caution, to recognize that Thistledown's worthless soil might conceal something considerably more valuable than any vineyard, something that would explain, with far greater clarity than any boundary dispute alone, precisely why 3 generations of Ravensmere dukes had wanted her family's small property gone, quietly and completely, from the map. Years later, the full truth would emerge in considerably greater detail than even Fairweather's careful letter suggested. But even now, walking the overgrown southern slope in the pale winter light, feeling the stony, unpromising soil beneath her boots, Cordelia understood enough to know that she was no longer merely the poor relation who had inherited a worthless field. She was, whether the Duke of Ravensmere yet realized it or not, the sole possessor of a secret his family had spent 3 generations trying to bury. There was, too, a smaller mystery that occupied Cordelia's attention in those early weeks, one that seemed at first entirely unconnected to the matter of boundaries and buried surveys, though it would prove, in time, to carry its own quiet significance. Among her cousin's papers, she found a bundle of correspondence from a woman named Mrs. Trent, once employed at Thistledown as a companion, and later, it seemed, dismissed rather abruptly under circumstances the letters did not fully explain. Mrs. Trent's letters, written across some years following her departure, carried a tone that struck Cordelia as peculiar. Grateful, almost obsequious in places, as though the woman felt herself indebted for some kindness beyond the ordinary courtesy owed a former employee, and yet undercut, in other passages, by a nervousness that suggested she wrote always with one eye towards some listener she feared might read the letters before they reached their destination. She asked Hobbs about the woman one evening and watched his weathered face grow, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely uneasy. Mrs. Trent, he said slowly, served your cousin some 25 years past, before my time in the house proper, though I recall her from my boyhood, when my father worked the stables here. She was dismissed of a sudden, and there was talk, servants' talk, mind, the kind that ought not to be repeated as gospel, that she had been discovered carrying letters between Thistledown and Ravensmere Park that neither house had properly sanctioned. Letters to whom? Cordelia asked, though some part of her had already begun to suspect the answer. That, miss, I never rightly knew. Only that your cousin's grandfather dismissed her without a character reference, which was a hard thing to do to a woman in that position, and harder still for a master as generally gentle as I always heard him described. Whatever she'd carried, it must have been a grave matter indeed for him to treat her so severely when by every other account he was not a severe man. It was Fairweather, upon his eventual arrival, who supplied the peace Hobbs could not. Among the county's old ecclesiastical records, painstakingly searched at Cordelia's request, he found reference to a private arrangement, never formally recorded as a marriage, but acknowledged obliquely in a parish register's marginal notation, between a junior member of the Ravensmere family, a younger son with no expectation of the title, and a woman of Thistledown's own household, dated some 70 years past, in precisely the period when the old survey had first been altered. I cannot say with certainty how the matter connects, Fairweather admitted, laying the fragile old register before her, but I would observe that a younger son of that generation, denied the dukedom by an elder brother's survival, might well have sought some private arrangement to secure his own fortune, and that a family eager to conceal such a match made beneath his station might have found it considerably useful to ensure that whatever inheritance or income resulted from it remained quietly folded into the larger estate, rather than acknowledged and divided as the law might otherwise require. Cordelia turned the delicate possibility over carefully, unwilling yet to draw conclusions she could not fully support. But she noted it, filed alongside the missing survey and the burned vines and Mrs. Trent's uneasy, obsequious letters, as one more thread in a pattern she was steadily learning to trust her own eye to trace. A pattern in which every small injustice done to Thistledown across 3 generations seemed to circle back, again and again, to the same careful, patient effort to keep something buried that the Ravensmere family had never quite found the nerve to destroy outright, only to hide. The Duke's second offer arrived within days of Fairweather's letter, delivered this time not by a mere steward, but by the Duke's own solicitor, a Mr. Grieve, whose polished manner and carefully rehearsed courtesy did little to disguise, to Cordelia's now practised eye, the particular urgency beneath his offer's generous terms. His Grace is prepared to be exceedingly generous, Grieve explained. Seated with evident discomfort in the modest parlour of a house so much smaller than any he was accustomed to visiting on the Duke's business, 4 times the property's assessed value, Miss Ashworth, along with a settlement sufficient to establish you quite comfortably wherever in England you might choose to reside. His Grace considers it, I might add, a considerable act of generosity toward a young woman in your circumstances. His Grace's generosity, Cordelia replied, with a composure she had not entirely possessed 3 months before, seems remarkably persistent for a scrap of land he himself described, I am told, as not worth the argument of owning. Something flickered across Grieve's carefully composed features. A flicker Cordelia recognized, with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a bluff begin to fail, as genuine surprise that she had heard those words at all. His Grace values consolidation of his estate boundaries, Grieve said, recovering smoothly. It is a matter of tidiness, nothing more. Then His Grace will not object, Cordelia said, if I decline his generous offer and instead have the boundary formally surveyed anew, using whatever historical records the county office can provide, including, I understand, an older survey that once existed but appears to have gone missing from the archives some decades past. I should be very glad of His Grace's assistance in locating it, given his evident interest in matters of boundary tidiness. The silence that followed told her, more plainly than any confession could have, precisely how close she had drawn to the truth. She sent Grieve away without an answer, and understood, watching his carriage depart down Thistledown's modest drive with considerably less composure than it had arrived, that the Duke of Ravensmere would not let the matter rest there. She was right. Within a fortnight, stranger things began to occur. A fire, small and swiftly contained, in the outbuilding where Hobbs stored the estate's few remaining tools, its cause never satisfactorily determined. A tenant farmer on the neighbouring Ravensmere land, who had once spoken to her cordially, now crossing the road rather than meet her eye. And, most alarming of all, a night when Cordelia woke to the distinct sound of footsteps in in the library below and descended to find the false panel behind which her cousin's diary had been hidden standing open, though nothing, so far as she could determine, had actually been taken. No one in the house spoke of it directly, not even Hobbs, though Cordelia noticed he had taken, without her asking, to sleeping in a chair near the library door each night thereafter, an old shotgun propped within easy reach. She understood, in the wake of these small, unsettling occurrences, that she could no longer conduct her investigation alone, in the isolated quiet of a house at the edge of a duke's vast domain. She needed allies, and she needed, above all, the missing survey, before whoever had searched her library succeeded in finding and destroying whatever remained of the truth it might yet prove. It was Mr. Fairweather, arriving at last in person some weeks later, who provided the breakthrough that would unravel, at last, the full and precise shape of the secret thistledown had guarded for 3 generations. He arrived on an evening of hard, driving rain, much as such revelations in old houses so often seem to arrive, and Cordelia received him in the library, with a fire built high against the chill, and Hobbs stationed, discreetly but unmistakably armed, in the hallway beyond. Fairweather was a precise, careful man, and he laid his findings before her with the same methodical patience she herself had come to value across her months of quiet investigation. "The strata beneath your southern slope," he began, "are consistent, my surveying colleagues assure me, with a substantial seam of high-quality coal, the kind increasingly prized in these years of expanding industry. By the ironworks and manufactories multiplying across the north of England, such a seam, properly worked, would be worth considerably more across its productive lifetime than the entirety of the Ravensmere estate's agricultural income combined." Cordelia sat very still, absorbing the full weight of what he had said. "And the Ravensmere family has known this," she said slowly, "for 3 generations. "I believe so," Fairweather said. "I have traced correspondence, discreetly and at some expense, suggesting that the present Duke's grandfather commissioned a private survey of the region some 70 years past, seeking new sources of income to fund the considerable expansion of Ravensmere Park undertaken during his tenure. That survey, I believe, identified the coal seam beneath what was then Thistledown's vineyard, and identified, too, that the boundary then recognised between the 2 estates placed the most valuable portion of that seam not within Ravensmere land at all, but within the modest holdings of your cousin's family." "And so the boundary was altered," Cordelia said, the pieces settling into place with a clarity that felt, after so many months of careful uncertainty, almost like relief. "I believe so," Fairweather confirmed. Quietly, through influence over the county surveyor of the time, and through the convenient disappearance of the original survey from the county archives. "Your cousin's grandfather, I suspect, discovered the alteration, perhaps through some remaining copy of the old survey, perhaps through the surveyor's own guilty conscience. And rather than fight a legal battle he had little hope of winning against a duke's influence, he tore up his own vines in a fit of despair and grief, and said nothing further of the matter for the remainder of his life, save what little he confided, I imagine, to his own diary, which your cousin in turn preserved for you to find. But if the boundary was altered," Cordelia said, "then the coal itself was never legally theirs to claim. It has always, properly, belonged to Thistledown. If the original survey can be found and its authenticity established," Fairweather said carefully, "then yes, Miss Ashworth, I believe a strong case could be made that the most valuable portion of that seam belongs, and has always belonged, entirely to you." The question, of course, was where the original survey might now be found, and it was Hobbs, of all people, listening quietly from the hallway with the particular attentiveness of a servant who has spent 4 decades absorbing details his employers never thought to ask him about, who at last provided the answer. "Begging your pardon, miss," he said, appearing in the library doorway with the diffidence of a man uncertain whether his knowledge was welcome. but I believe I know where the old paper might be found." He led them, that same night, despite the rain, to the estate's small, disused chapel, long since fallen out of regular use, its pews dusty, its single window admitting only a thin grey light, even at midday. Beneath the stone floor before the altar, accessible through a flagstone Hobbs identified with the confidence of a man who had watched it lifted once before, decades earlier, lay a small iron box, and within that box, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well against the damp, the original survey. Its ink faded, but its lines and figures still perfectly legible, its boundary marked in a hand that matched, when compared against other county records of the same period, precisely the hand of the county surveyor whose signature also appeared, considerably more hastily rendered, on the later, altered survey that presently governed the disputed land. "Your cousin's grandfather hid it here himself, I'd wager," Hobbs said, watching Cordelia lift the box with hands that trembled now with something considerably brighter than fear, in the one place he knew a Ravensmere would never think to search, a chapel he attended himself, God-fearing man that he was, while the Duke's family kept their own private chapel up at the great house and never set foot in this humble little one from one year's end to the next. She held the proof, at last, of everything her cousin's diary had hinted at and Fairweather's careful inquiries had confirmed, proof that would unravel, in the weeks and months that followed, 60 years of quiet Ravensmere deception, and would transform Thistledown, in the eyes of every family in the county who had once mocked its modest, unpromising soil, into something no one would ever again think to call worthless. The confrontation, when it came, took place not in the grand halls of Ravensmere Park, where the Duke might have hoped to overwhelm her with the sheer scale of his own consequence, but in the modest parlour of Thistledown itself, at Cordelia's own insistence, conveyed through a letter whose careful, unyielding formality left the Duke, by his solicitor's later account, considerably more unsettled than he cared to admit. He arrived on a clear, cold morning, his carriage looking almost absurdly grand against Thistledown's modest gravel drive, and Cordelia received him with a composure that surprised even herself. The composure, she realized, of a woman who no longer needed to wonder whether she held anything of value, because she now held, quite literally, proof folded carefully in a leather portfolio upon the parlour table between them. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, seating himself with the easy authority of a man who had never once in his life doubted his welcome in any room he entered. "I understand you have declined my solicitor's most recent offer. I confess myself curious as to your reasoning, given the property's rather evident want of value. Your Grace is very kind to concern yourself so persistently with a property of so little value," Cordelia replied, and watched, with quiet satisfaction, the same flicker of unease she had seen cross Greaves' face weeks before. "I wonder, though, whether your Grace's grandfather shared quite the same assessment some 70 years ago, when he commissioned a private survey of the land beneath my southern slope." The silence that followed was considerably longer and considerably more telling than any that had come before it. She laid the old survey before him then, alongside her cousin's final diary and Fairweather's careful correspondence, and watched the Duke of Ravensmere, a man who had spent his entire life certain of his own supremacy in every room he occupied, confront, for what she suspected was the first time in his adult life, evidence that his family's fortune had been built, in some small but undeniable part, upon a theft his own grandfather had commissioned and his own father had inherited without troubling to question. "This changes nothing regarding the current legal boundary," he said at last, though his voice carried less certainty than his words intended. "It changes a great deal, Your Grace," Cordelia said, "regarding what a court would very likely conclude, were I to bring this survey, and the correspondence surrounding it, before a magistrate. I do not particularly wish to do so. I would very much prefer, in fact, to reach an arrangement considerably more equitable than the one your family has enforced upon mine for 3 generations. But I will not be bullied into selling what is rightfully mine at a fraction of its true worth, nor frightened into silence by fires in outbuildings or midnight searches of my library, both of which I suspect, Your Grace, were rather less coincidental than they were made to appear. It took the Duke of Ravensmere a long moment to answer, and when he did, something in his bearing had shifted. Not defeat, precisely, but the particular recalibration of a man forced, for the first time, to see another person clearly rather than merely as an obstacle to be removed. "What arrangement," he said at last, "would you consider equitable, Miss Ashworth?" What followed, in the months after that confrontation, was a negotiation conducted not through solicitors alone, but increasingly through direct correspondence between Cordelia and the Duke himself. Correspondence that began in the guarded, formal tones of adversaries and shifted, gradually, into something that surprised them both. The boundary was formally corrected, the Coalseam's ownership settled in Cordelia's favour with a legal clarity that no future Ravensmere heir could dispute, and the Duke, in what the county considered nothing short of remarkable, personally financed the initial survey and sinking of the first proper mine shaft on Thistledown land. In exchange for a fair and binding share of its future profit, an arrangement that transformed, within 2 years, the little estate everyone had once mocked as worthless into one of the most productive small holdings in the entire county. Cordelia did not stop there. She used the income from the coal, carefully and patiently, to restore the vineyard her cousin's grandfather had torn up in grief so many decades before, planting new vines on the northern slope where the Coalseam did not run, and within a handful of years, Thistledown wine was once again spoken of favourably as far as London, this time under the direction of a mistress whose name the county no longer mentioned with pity, but with a respect that had been earned, root and stone, through her own patient labour. She restored the house itself as well, not to grandeur, for she had come to value Thistledown's modest proportions and honest, unpretentious character too much to wish it transformed into some lesser echo of Ravensmere's overwhelming scale, but to a warmth and soundness it had not known in decades. The chapel where the old survey had lain hidden was repaired and reconsecrated, and Cordelia had her cousin's diary and her cousin's grandfather's old, faded original survey framed and hung together in the library, where anyone who doubted the little estate's worth might see, plainly recorded, precisely what it had once cost a family to protect it. The Duke of Ravensmere, in time, became something Cordelia had never once expected to find in the man who had so carelessly dismissed her inheritance as not worth the argument of owning, not quite a friend, for the wound of his family's long deception never entirely healed between them, but a genuine and considerable admirer. Drawn back to Thistledown's modest parlour with a regularity the county gossips found endlessly fascinating, to discuss matters of coal yields and vine cultivation with a woman he had once believed beneath his notice, and had come, slowly and with evident humility, to recognise as considerably his equal in patience, in intelligence, and in the particular kind of quiet strength that builds an empire not through inheritance, but through one's own 2 hands. The matter of Mrs. Trent and the quiet, unrecorded marriage Fairweather had uncovered was resolved, in the end, with rather less drama than Cordelia had feared, and rather more grace than she had dared hope for. The Duke, once the larger deception of the boundary and the coal had been laid bare between them, proved unexpectedly willing to have the older matter examined as well, and a careful search of the Ravensmere family's own private papers, undertaken, this time, with his own cooperation rather than in spite of his resistance, confirmed what Fairweather had only cautiously suggested. A younger Ravensmere son, passed over for the title, had indeed married quietly into the Thistledown household, and a small annuity, meant to provide for that marriage's descendants, had been quietly absorbed into the larger estate accounts when the son died childless and inconvenient questions of inheritance no longer seemed likely to arise. Mrs. Trent, it transpired, had been dismissed not for any impropriety of her own, but for having witnessed the arrangement and having once, in a moment of indiscretion, suggested to a Thistledown groundskeeper that the family were owed rather more than history had recorded. The Duke, upon learning this, insisted on locating whatever descendants of that quiet, forgotten marriage yet remained, and settled upon them a modest but respectable sum, a gesture Cordelia recognized, watching him arrange it with evident and unfamiliar humility, as the first genuine act of restitution his family had offered in 3 generations of careful, comfortable silence. She never sold Thistledown, though offers considerably more generous than the Duke's original ones arrived, in time. From other quarters entirely, once word of the estate's transformation had spread through the county and beyond. She kept it, instead, exactly as small as it had always been in acreage, and exactly as large as it had become in reputation, a rival, in every particular that mattered, to the vast and ancient kingdom that had once mocked it, and a rival earned not through any inheritance of scale, but through the patient, unglamorous work of a woman the world had once dismissed as having nothing left to offer it. It is said, by those who tell the story still, in the villages that surround what remains one of the North's most celebrated small estates, that Cordelia Ashworth kept the Duke's original letter, the dismissive offer that had first informed her of his low opinion of her modest inheritance, pressed between the pages of her cousin's diary for the whole of her life, not out of bitterness, but as a quiet, private reminder of precisely how much a person's worth can be misjudged by those who measure it only in acres. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate, of a woman handed a scrap of land the world called worthless, who discovered within its modest, mocked soil not merely a fortune, but the truth of her own considerable strength, and who built, from a single small field at the edge of a duke's vast domain, a legacy that no amount of inherited grandeur could ever quite overshadow. Visitors to that corner of the county, in the years that followed, would sometimes remark upon the curious sight of Thistledown's low stone house sitting so modestly beside the sprawling grandeur of Ravensmere Park, and would ask, invariably, how so small a property had come to rival so vast an inheritance. The answer, offered by those who had watched the transformation unfold across those quiet, patient years, was always the same, and always delivered with a certain fondness reserved for stories that reward not the loudest voice in the room, but the steadiest one. That greatness, it seemed, was never truly a matter of acreage at all, but of the patience to dig where others had told you nothing worthwhile could be found, and the courage to keep digging long after the world had stopped watching. If Cordelia's quiet triumph found its way into your evening tonight, wherever in the world that evening happens to be unfolding, let us know below where you are watching from, and if you found yourself rooting for the small estate against the great kingdom at its border, consider subscribing, so that the next story of patience rewarded and quiet strength proven arrives for you the very moment it is told.